Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. What's that? Is that good to see? All right. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Welcome to our first Lunch with Books of 2022. And I was the first offender here. I'm hoping everybody takes my example and silences their cell phone right now. Just sort of thing. If you're new to Lunch with Books, we do have a mailing list. If you'd like to join the mailing list, there is a box in the back there. Just drop your email into it. We'll send you weekly updates for both Lunch with Books and for our People's University series. All right, a few program announcements before we get started here. Next week at Lunch with Books, Tuesday, January 11th, we'll be covering Lincoln's Bastille, also known as Wheeling's Athenaeum. In 14 short years, the Athenaeum's existence was a crucial witness to both cultural and Civil War history of Wheeling in the era. It was a warehouse, a theater, and a prison. Local history researcher Ed Phillips will share interesting facts and stories, including notable performances, prisoner escapes, and a major tragedy that ended the building's action-packed history far too soon. That's next week, January 11th, Tuesday at noon. The following Monday, January 17th, the library will be closed for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And then the following Tuesday, that's 2 weeks from today. I don't know why I put 3 fingers up. It's 2 weeks. Tuesday, January 18th at Lunch with Books, we'll be having a program on the lost history of Frederick Douglass in Wheeling. Internationally known orator, abolitionist, editor, suffragist, and American reformist, the history and placement of Frederick Douglass in the field of Appalachian studies has not been considered and recognized until recently. John Moeller, author and co-founder of Lost History Associates in Washington, D.C., will tell us about the sojourns of Frederick Douglass in Wheeling for a larger portfolio of more than half a dozen visits he made in West Virginia in the mid to late 1800s. So that's 2 weeks from today, Tuesday, January 18th at Lunch with Books. The Monday before that, the 17th, we will be closed. And then just a reminder, this Thursday, January 6th at 7 p.m., we'll have the next People's University Cold War class. That's class 6. Dr. Joe Labor will be back with us for a global war. We'll discuss the broad ideological, economic, military, and diplomatic factors of the global Cold War struggle. Concentrating on places where conflict took place, including Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Today's guests are Dr. Sarah Morris. Dr. Morris teaches undergraduate writing courses and is the associate coordinator for the undergraduate writing program at WVU. Her research interests include human science, phenomenology, embodiment, writing process, and student-centered teaching. She received the 2020-2021 WVU Humanities Center Fellowship to work on her forthcoming book, Transformation, Translation, and Compilation, Taking Home Country Roads. Fallen Speed native Bob Gaudio is Assistant Public Defender for the First Judicial Circuit Public Defender Corporation. He was the chair of the board of the Upper Ohio Valley Italian Festival for more than 5 years. He's very active with Legal Aid of West Virginia, and he's the long-term board member for Youth Services Systems. He's also an actor, and in a capacity that he's here with us today, a musician locally known as the Troubadour. Please give a warm welcome to Bob Gaudio and Dr. Sarah Morris.
Thanks. Erin's from Wisconsin, so she's looking forward to Thursday with all the snow that's coming. This is a song by Hazel Dickens and Alice Gerard from 1973. West Virginia, oh my home. West Virginia, where I belong. In the dead of the night, in the still and the quiet, I slip away like an inside look through those hills, place that I call home. It's been years now since I left there, and this city life's about got the best of me. I can't remember why I left so free, what I wanted to do, wanted to see, but I can sure remember where I come from West Virginia. If you know it, sing it. Oh, my home. West Virginia, where I belong. In the dead of the night and the still and the quiet, I slip away like a bird in flight, back to those hills, place that I call home. Well, I have paid the price for believing, and this life I have is not the one that I thought I'd find. Just let me live and love and let me cry, and when I go, just let me die among my friends who remember me when I'm gone. From West Virginia, for my home. West Virginia, where I belong. In the dead of the night and the still and the quiet, I slip away like a bird in flight, back to those hills, place that I call home. Home, home, home. I can see it so clearly in my mind. Home, 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 home. I can almost smell those honeysuckle vines. In the dead of the night, still and quiet, I slip away like a bird in flight, back to those hills, place that I call home. In the dead of the night, and the still and the quiet, I slip away like a bird in flight, back to those hills, place that I call home. Home. That's out. Yeah. Amazing. Thanks. Thank you. There's one guest there who didn't introduce. This is Lawrence Lizard. Lawrence is my constant companion. He does have his PPE on today because lizards aren't on the list yet for vaccination. So he will wear his mask until such time as he gets his vaccination. His last name is 2 Z's, by the way. It's Lizard. Ellen King wrote a poem way back in 1879, and then the Reverend David King helped her out a little bit. That was her husband. I think she wrote the most of it. And then in 1885, Henry Everett Engel wrote a tune to the poem. If you've ever been to 4-H camp, this is one you sing every morning at breakfast back in the West Virginia 4-H camp. There are 2 verses to this song that we don't normally hear because it's a prayer. It involves God. And when the state legislature in 1961 decided to make it a state song, they took out the 2 verses that sort of sounded like a prayer because church and state, right? I'm going to sing you those verses. Oh, the West Virginia hills, how majestic and how grand, with their summits bathed in glory like the Prince Emmanuel's land. Is it any wonder then that my heart with rapture thrilled as I stand once more with loved ones on the West Virginia hill? Oh, those hills, those beautiful hills, how I love the West Virginia hill. If all the sea or land I roam, still I think of happy home. Yeah, sing it. And my friends along the West Virginia hill. Oh, the West Virginia hills, where my childhood hours would pass, where I often wandered lonely and my future tried to cast. Many are our visions bright, which the future ne'er fulfilled. But how sunny were my daydreams on the West Virginia hill. Take that. Oh, those hills, those beautiful hills, how I love the West Virginia hill. If all the sea of land I roam, still I think of happy home. And my friends along the West Virginia hill. Here's the verse. Oh, the West Virginia hills, how unchanged they seem to stand, with their summits pointed skyward to the great Almighty's land. They many changes I can see, which my heart would sadden still. But no changes can be noticed on those West Virginia hills. Oh, those hills, those beautiful hills. How I love the West Virginia hills. If I see you land that road, still I think of happy home. And my friends along the West Virginia hills. Oh, the West Virginia hills, I must be now with you. If I won't be on the mountains, I shall never dream of you. In the evening time of life, if my Father only will, I shall stand still, behold the vision of those West Virginia hills. Sing with me. Oh, those hills, those beautiful hills. I love the West Virginia hills. If I see you land that road, still I think of happy home. And my friends along the West Virginia hills.
I like those last two verses. I do. I think those last two verses should come back in. One more for you, and then we're going to introduce Dr. Morris, who's going to come up and tell us about a great song that I've been playing since, I think since they wrote it, a long time ago. Yeah. In 1977, I went off to, I was here one day, years ago, talking with the Hoogans, and Bill, about our Peace Corps experience. And one of my friends is here in the room, Johnny Ganacter, was in Yemen with me when we were, he was with the State Department, I was with the Peace Corps. That's where we met. And I was missing home with Thanksgiving, and I thought, I'm gonna write a song about West Virginia. And it's called West Virginia Woman, and I sure hope you like it.
She descends upon a cloud from the Appalachian Mountain, spirit wild and restless as the old Ohio road. Her hair is like a satin night and the still light falls forward. Her eyes reflect the glimmer in a rain of blackest coal. Oh, my West Virginia woman, gold in autumn's many colors. Can you see these tears of yearning for the place from which I roam? And will you send me mountain music for the soothing little memory? Oh, my West Virginia woman, I'm so far, far away from home. From Chester down to Bloomfield, or the hills and over the city, you can feel her very essence in the melody she plays. She strums her gentle fingers across the boards along the heartland, a simple dancer rhapsody and thoughts of younger days. Oh, my West Virginia woman, golden in autumn's many colors. Can you see these tears of yearning for the place from which I roam? And will you send me mountain music or soothe me with a memory? Oh, my West Virginia woman, so far, far away from home. Well, the lakes and rivers send their greetings as they gurgle beneath her feet. Fountain cold lights sing her praises every orchard, every street. Like Miss Mary West Virginia, you can hear her about your dream. Here in the West by God, Virginia, mountaineer, always free. Oh, now West Virginia woman, gold in autumn's many colors. Can you see these tears of yearning for the place from which I roam? And will you send me mountain music or to soothe me with a memory? Oh, my West Virginia woman, not so far away from home. Oh, my West Virginia woman, I'm so far away from home. That's it. Thank you. Dr. Morris, please.
So welcome, everyone. As you may know, last week was the 51st anniversary of the debut of Take Me Home Country Roads. And like many West Virginians, I have known and heard country roads my entire life, but I have a complicated relationship with it, and you might also. Before we really get started, I do want to qualify that I'm not a musicologist. My area of research is centered specifically in rhetoric and composition. I'm an interpretive researcher. I'm also always a teacher. So I approach my work with an orientation toward learning, always. I've used a range of research methods for this project, including things like text analysis, a public survey, interviews, archival research at the West Virginia Library, and digital ethnography to find themes that relate to the research questions that I've developed around country roads. So the scope of this project really explores the way that country roads is taken up as a marker of identity and a call to home, not just for West Virginians, but for people all over the world. I wondered how the song came to be that way, and why, and what it means. After a few years of research, I contend that there's a set of conditions that contribute to country roads as a phenomenon, rather than just a song. And those relate to things like marketing, social and cultural meanings, and identity rhetoric. That really has specific implications for West Virginians. I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned, though keep in mind a presentation this short can't possibly address it all. And these are just some of my questions. So one of the interesting aspects to me of Take Me Home Country Roads is the origin story, or rather the mythology around it. So, for example, many people have told me about impossible 1960s encounters with John Denver in West Virginia that speak to his deep love of the state. Other folks are adamant that none of the songwriters had ever had any West Virginia connection at all. When I spoke with Bill Danoff and Taffy Nyder, who were the original songwriters, as well as other folks who were fans of theirs in the 1970s, what I learned was a bit more complicated. Many others have already written about the story behind the song, but I'll summarize a few important points here. The songwriters did have at least some peripheral connection to West Virginia. John Denver had played in West Virginia at least one show that I've been able to find at Concord College in the fall of 1970, so just before the song was written. And Danoff and Nyder performed as a band called Fat City in those days. They had lots of friends who lived in the Eastern Panhandle, so they were familiar with West Virginia. But the most direct connection to the state is through Taffy Nyder, whose father grew up in Southwest Pennsylvania. He was a coal miner before he went to work in Washington, D.C. And she went to college in Steubenville, Ohio, so right across the river. She told me that she spent time here in Wheeling quite a bit, that she got her hair done, and her favorite restaurant was here. And she told me a story about being in her dorm room in Steubenville and looking across the river at West Virginia. The other myth to dispel here relates to John Denver's role in the song's origin. Danoff and Neibert had been performing versions of the song prior to sharing it with Denver, and with him, they modified the bridge and they replaced a verse. So there's a lost verse that we can talk about if you have questions about it later. But otherwise, the song was intact, and they had been playing it all over DC. And that was confirmed by a lot of the folks who I talked to who had been friends of theirs in the 60s and 70s. They said many times that they knew the song was a hit from the very first time they played it. But another interesting tidbit here is that part of the song's enthusiastic reception and its debut was due to a group of West Virginians who were occupying the front table at the Cellar Door that night. And when they heard the name of their state in the song, they stood up and they screamed. And apparently that was contagious. And so the whole audience gave them a standing ovation to the song. And from there, of course, the three recorded it, and it was an almost instant hit. It garnered radio requests and strong public reception from the very first days of its release. In my surveys and interviews, people have reported having heard country roads all over the world. I've had this experience myself, you probably have too, and the song taps into a universal longing for home and belonging. Taffy Neibert described it to me as a little bird that has flown all around the world, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. She attributes its popularity to its simplicity and the way it develops a primal harmony and chord patterns, but really much of its popularity was due to its marketing. There were immediately many cover versions. Danoff told me that when RCA realized that they had a hit on their hands, they wanted to release it worldwide, so they began distributing it to other artists and markets, and from there, the song rippled out to different genres and audiences all over the world. We'll take a few moments to listen to some different versions, just clips from a couple of the early ones. Ray Charles and Olivia Newton-John. And I want you to notice how different they are from each other, but also how similar they are to Denver's version. So let's see how we can make this version work. Be able to find it. There it is. All right, so let's listen to a clip from the Ray Charles version first.
Almost West Virginia, you're in my bed, shade of the I just hold that, hold out the trees, younger than the mountains, where like a breeze, got to go, I'll take time to say. West Virginia,
That's great.
Isn't it great? So that's just a little clip from the Ray Charles version. I wish we had time to listen to every version. So that was 1972. Olivia Newton-John's version was 1973. I'll listen to it a little bit too. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home, country road. West Virginia, Blue Mountains shine over the wall. Love is open, older than the trees, younger than the mountains, rolling like a breeze. Country roads, take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia.
Changing on until
So you hear the difference? One is kind of poppy and the other is kind of gospel, but they both combine the different elements. And what's really interesting here is that we can trace the lineage of both of these versions kind of across the globe. So we have all these different tributes to home, but what we start to see is that home is sometimes West Virginia and sometimes it isn't. So we'll listen to a couple more examples. Toots and the Maytals replaced West Virginia with West Jamaica, and they used landmarks and notions particular to their place. And that was in '73. So let's listen to a clip from this one. You can hear the Ray Charles in that version, right? So there's this kind of extension, and yet they've completely made it their own, which is, I think, really fascinating. In 1972, Marie Laforêt recorded Monty STC, in which lyrics are completely changed. So we'll listen to a clip from this one as well.
dans le bruit de l'océan, mon enfance recommence, mon pays est ici.
So I don't know if anybody knows French. Anybody speak French? It's a little bit the chorus translates roughly in that version to "My country is here in the noise of the ocean. My childhood begins anew. My country is here." So not only is it in French, it has no references to West Virginia at all. It's not about West Virginia. It's about Canada. So, an interesting story. Someone told me that the Marie Laforêt version is an unofficial anthem in Canada, and I was contacted by a children's choir director who says that they sing it at national events, and that children sing it much like we did Country Roads when I was a little girl. So these are a couple of other examples that we'll listen to. Israel Kamakawi-Bole recorded a Hawaiian tribute in 1993. Let's see if we can get right. So you can hear that it's the same, but different. The Moipe Quartet, who at the time that they recorded this in 2002, were teenage girls. They're all sisters. We'll listen to a little bit more of this one. It's a Kenyan version, and it's really beautiful. It's one of my favorites. still waters, dusty, on the sky, left your rolling dust of bring tears to my eyes. Isn't that lovely? So I wish we had more time. But I think the important point here is that many of these versions, like the Tips and the Maytals version, that they more resemble different versions of the song, like the Ray Charles version. And many of the Asian and European recordings were influenced by WVU John rather than John Denver, because it was really popular, her version in Japan and other Asian countries. So we can trace this kind of lineage, and it's fueled by marketing and a recording industry through nearly 300 recorded versions in the last 50 years, and variations beyond those versions in English in more than 20 different languages. But that's not to say that the song doesn't carry its own kind of power. So Country Roads has this distinctive, simple melody. It's got easily sung lyrics and a message about a universal heartache for home, whether the listeners from West Virginia or not. The Welsh describe this kind of heartache as hirai, or it's more about a felt sense for place or person, perhaps a home that we know, but more like an idealized home, one that we can't quite return to, but the home of our memories and our hearts, rather than the actual home that exists in tangible space and time. This kind of idealized home, along with a pastoral sense of setting, is really a hallmark of country music. And that country music captures both homesickness and longing and a setting that's more natural. Heroic is also this kind of intersubjective feeling, so that when we think of the home in Country Roads, it's not a house or a town or a state so much where we grew up. It's really the place we belong. And West Virginians have long felt that particular kind of homesickness, a notion of variety. In a cultural context, Country Roads gives us a framework to talk and think about our identity as West Virginians in a new way. And it can influence the stories we tell about ourselves and that we tell about our place. So in April 1971, when Country Roads came out, a warm reception was immediate throughout West Virginia. This image is a clipping from the Charleston Daily Mail, and it documents Denver's performance of the song at the state capitol on August 29th of that year, just a few months after the song was released. One person who was there told me that there were thousands of people, and that they had to shut down Canal Boulevard entirely, and the crowd went wild over John Denver and Country Roads. But maybe the most interesting thing about this article is that it prints the lyrics of the song in their entirety, just like we saw with church hymnals in the West Virginia hills. The resonance was there for West Virginians from the moment that the song was released, and it continues today. As a state, we had suffered out-migration for some time during this time, from the end of the 50s all the way through to when Country Roads was released. And that out-migration, of course, continues today. We have monumental losses in Vietnam, and homesickness and longing were kind of a mood in West Virginia. Country Roads put words and melody to what people were already feeling. And West Virginians took up that song as a marker of that feeling and of identity almost immediately. WVU joined that resonance and that interest by jumping on the marketing potential. They bought the rights to Country Roads in 1972, so only a year after its release. And it's ever present on campus. We can hear it at the Caroline Bells, at the Alumni Center, Woodburn Hall. It's played at celebrations, in recruitment and graduations, and of course, in sports. There's so many references around us on campus at WVU that's really part of the cultural language of campus. And students take it up as a marker of home and community and identity too. So we can see it on their laptops and on clothes, on cars, on graduation mortar boards, like in this photo, and even on their bodies that they tattoo the song lyrics. And probably more than the college students do that. So for West Virginia and for Mountaineers, we know that this song represents a tellable narrative that taps into a sense of created community and shared place. It allows us to perform our identities in a way that's positive. It calls to us when we're away from home. Many West Virginians have shared with me hundreds of stories about hearing country roads in faraway places and emotions like amazement, nostalgia, connection, homesickness, right? You're right. These are just a few examples of some of what people have told me. But all of these exemplify the kind of affiliation and connection to identity that West Virginians feel when they hear a song outside the state. It's a simplistic version of shared homesickness, told from away by people who imagine the space, but that imagination of what West Virginia is in the song aligns just enough with reality that it reflects back at us like a magic mirror. So it allows us to look at ourselves in certain ways and project our identities in certain ways, but it's also in always more complicated than that. There are limits to who can take up the song and who it belongs to in certain contexts. And we can see that in an incident from February 2012 when Marquette basketball coach Buzz Williams danced to Country Roads on his way to the press table in a post-game victory celebration. So you can probably guess what happened. So we'll watch this incident. Watch the students. So you can see that students had to be held back to prevent mob violence. And so this was a performance of identity, right? Like he's using this to celebrate, but it's not his. There are potentially dangerous consequences in this situation. Scholar Ann Selby tells us that Appalachians live in a real place that other people see as symbolic. But there's a gap between reality and symbolism, and that's where we interact with the world. So we use pre-existing narratives of West Virginian identity, often relying on stereotypes, to shape our own stories of identity and to negotiate cultural scripts that are reflected back at us. And this kind of identity performance is highly visible, and it's linked to a concept of tellability. And we can see what happens when it's not done correctly in some cultural contexts. So the narratives that we hear and tell about place, about Appalachia, according to Appalachian studies scholars, reflect common assumptions through emphasis on themes like poverty, educational deficits, literacy, and other stereotypes. Framed through the scope or concept of tellability, these kinds of stories are socially, politically, and politically constructed, and they fit within frameworks that are easily read as true because they align with cultural expectations. Untellable narratives, right, the ones that we don't hear in media, on the other hand, are ones that defy categories of experience, and they're closer to individual lived experiences and maybe closer to the truth, but they don't fit within the acceptable or expected public discourse. So tellable narratives reflect a legacy of Appalachia. We've been defined and named from the outside historically through absentee land ownership, travel literature in the 1800s, through politics, policy, through popular culture. This outside naming perpetuates reductive stereotypes. And the people and the places where we live. And sometimes we assist those stereotypes. So sometimes that assistance is resistance, right? We can actively fight against some of the stereotypes that people use and say about West Virginians. But sometimes that assistance is acceptance, which is, I think, what we see with country roads. So when we're used to being named from the outside, and when we're used to being named negatively, we're more easily to take up a positive naming from the outside instead of claiming and naming for ourselves. And that's what we tend to see with country roads. So what does it mean to embrace this kind of outside naming? Carissa Massey, who studies rhetorical forms and cultural artifacts and Appalachian stereotypes, she says that Appalachian people in particular are seen as a kind of counterpoint to the typical America. So we're used as a foil in that way. And she suggests that signs of deviance purport to point at a truth about being Appalachian and also about America as a whole. So negative conceptions of Appalachians are often represented through cultural artifacts that are subjective. They're misinterpretive, and they're signs of social signification that aren't true. If we think about this, how cultural artifacts present truth becomes truth, whether it is or not. And these perceptions influence how we see the world as well as how the world sees us. So when we have limited options for positive representation, we can choose to present ourselves using country roads to point out truth that we can accept in the face of conceived truth that maybe isn't true. The West Virginia represented in country roads we know is idealized. It's part of a long tradition of writing about Appalachia rather than writing from Appalachia. And that lines up with all the other ways we're affected by extraction and imposed definitions. So I wondered why country roads when there are so many West Virginian songwriters who portray the place and its people more clearly and more complexly and more accurately, as we've seen with the songs that Bob shared with us today. So embracing country roads allows us to resist other stereotypes. What might happen if we pushed it away too and embraced the songs that really are about West Virginia? So I want to address our official state songs, but I won't discuss this much since I know that last week's talk addressed some of them. We've already heard the West Virginia Hills today. It was published in 1885, and it's the one I think that most of us know. I remember learning it from my grandmother, who was an elementary school teacher, and I remember singing it in 4-H. It was actually the second official state song, though. It was adopted after West Virginia, My Home Sweet Home, which was written by a Wheeling resident. In 1963, the state legislature declared 3 state songs official, including This Is My West Virginia, as well as the other 2, and it was written in 1962. Country Roads was added to that in 2014. My survey research, interestingly, revealed that about 80% of my respondents, so close to 250 surveys, only about 80% of them knew no other songs about West Virginia. They only knew Country Roads. And most of those who did know other songs about West Virginia were from West Virginia and knew only the West Virginia Hills. No one mentioned the other two state songs. So one idea here is that many of us don't know there are any other songs about West Virginia. And this is facilitated by a global music industry that amplifies some voices and overpowers other voices. So one theme that I've uncovered as I've worked on this project is the necessity of engaging with a difficult story, maybe a truer story, and that's what Sarah Webster calls an untellable narrative. Travis Steinlein's work demonstrates that West Virginia musicians don't generally write this simple kind of love letter that Country Roads is, but they do engage with ideas and concepts that are more complex and tied deeply to place, to that insider perspective. They write songs of protest, they write songs of remembrance, of real people and real places. They write about their pride, but they recognize the complication and complexity inherent in writing from place rather than about place. So the songs on this slide are just three of my favorites. We've already heard Hazel Dickens' song, West Virginia My Home. And I'll share my slides with you, and I have handouts so that you can listen to these on your own. But I do want us to listen to a couple of other examples that are really recent. And these demonstrate the sense of writing from rather than writing about West Virginia. So these are two folks who generously spoke with me about their West Virginian identities and their work as songwriters. The first clip that I want to share with you is John Ellison's song, West Virginia State of Mind. And it, like Country Roads, it depicts positive imagery, but it's imagery that's complex and recognizable to us, but maybe not recognizable to folks outside the state. So we'll take a little listen to John Ellison's song.
West Virginia, stay alive. West Virginia, stay alive. I've been seeing the cold drops off the cold from the line. They're on their fucking chairs, get away the time. I was singing my name, playing checkers with his friend. I've been scared his laughter each time that he win. I miss the sweet, sweet smell. Mama's blackberry cobbler and the sound of birds singing in the summertime. I hear West Virginia, stay alive.
So it has this really specific imagery, right? Things that we can recognize. Cold shots, blackberry cobbler, these are things that might not resonate as positive images or homesick images to someone from outside the state. The other example that I want to share with you is from Colleen Anderson's song, If You Love My West Virginia. And this song was inspired by the 2014 Elk River chemical spill. She actually wrote it to sing at a public hearing in front of the legislature. And we'll take a little listen to it too.
If you love my West Virginia, you will keep her waters clean. If you love my West Virginia, you will keep her mountains green. If you love my West Virginia, love her wonderful and wild. You'll respect her like your mother and defend her like your child. If you love my West Virginia, you would suffer for her sake. If you love my West Virginia, You will give more than you take. If you love my West Virginia, you would breathe to see her kneel to the ones who only use her for the riches they can steal.
Right? But these songs are both particular. Right? So if you are from West Virginia, you recognize these images and you recognize the resonance. If you're not from West Virginia, it doesn't resonate in the same way. So these are both really specific and particular to place. And there are, of course, many, many more that we could discuss. Songs that present closer reality than Country Roads does. All right, so this is the place where we come to implications for teaching and learning. This is where I always orient. So much of my work is about teaching people, young people especially, to communicate clearly and with ethos from who they are, where they are. So I always orient this way. And I'll close with a few thoughts about what we can teach and what we can learn. The first lesson here is that context is important. In politics and in popular culture, there was a renewed interest in Appalachia in the 1960s. But much of that interest was tied to poverty, economy, and saving the region from outside. That interest included President Kennedy's visits to West Virginia, establishment of the Appalachian Regional Commission, and efforts to improve infrastructure through road building and other efforts. It played out culturally in TV specials, news features, fiction, and film. It was impossible to ignore West Virginia in the late 1960s, but much of the public discourse was related to deficits and deficiency, and it still is in some ways today. In that context, West Virginians were portrayed negatively, typically, but Country Roads spoke, and I think still speaks, this positive image in the face of those demeaning stereotypes. And this was fueled by the local music industry. So for listeners everywhere, the song represents the virtue of almost heaven as a place of belonging. But for West Virginians specifically, when we face the ugliness of what's often said about us, we can view Country Roads and suddenly we're recognizable outside those negative stereotypes anywhere in the world. So we've taken it up as ours, even though it doesn't tell the whole story. And the songs that do are maybe too complicated for sharing with folks outside the family. My research has confirmed a lot of what I already knew about how West Virginians take up the song. We play at family gatherings, around campfires, at parties. We play it when we cross the state line, coming home from vacation. It's amazing how many people told me that when they were children, their parents would put the tape in the tape player to play Country Roads when they crossed the state line. And people still do this. We request it in bars, when there's a band playing, we're away from home, we sing at graduations, proms, weddings, funerals. And the whole time, we know that it's not really accurate. Country Roads is kind of the imagined place that maybe we wish we were. And some folks reject it entirely because it isn't ours, it's written by outsiders. But I think there's a danger in that insider-outsider dichotomy. And when we oversimplify, we can fully embrace something that doesn't really describe us, or we can fully reject something that doesn't really describe us. But I think that we can love it and recognize that it doesn't tell the story. Part of the impact of the work that I've been doing is to engage with counter stories alongside Country Roads, right? So the two together as texts that portray the complexity of who we are. Hicks and Ambrose in their work in West Virginia add to Royal Jones's assertion that we should tell our own stories and stop looking to others to tell the story for us. So Country Roads is a mirror that reflects us back, but it's not a mirror of our own making, and we can be honest about that. We can love country roads, and we can recognize its capacity to sugarcoat and oversimplify, and we can still speak the truth about West Virginia by choosing to be more aware and to amplify the stories told from West Virginia, and not just the ones told about West Virginia. And that's true in any kind of communications that we have about our place. So as I close, I just want to say that I'm grateful to the West Virginia University Humanities Center for providing me the funding and the West Virginia Humanities Council for providing me the funding. I'm still collecting thoughts from songwriters and from everyday people who engage with the song. And I'd love to hear your stories too. So feel free to send me an email, or you can answer my survey. There's a QR code here. And I'll also share my slides with you. Thank you so much for coming and listening, and I hope that we have some time to continue the conversation with questions. And if you'd like a link to my slides, it's here, and I have handouts if you want to pick one up on the way out.
And there's just, before we go to questions, one thing I forgot in my announcements is that we do have a stage costume from John Denver here, thanks to the Wheeling Jamboree, and there's some photos on the table here that show me wearing that costume. Dave, did you want to say anything about that?
That hopefully will be on exhibit at our museum when it's completed. If you are familiar with the former Eagles building on Main Street, we're attempting to renovate that as the Jamboree Museum. We have actually over 100 exhibits of stage wear from anybody from John Denver to Johnny Cash and so on. So we're looking to get that building open as a museum here, really dedicated to the Jamboree. And we're looking for volunteers also if you'd like to be involved with that.
Thanks. All right, we can take questions now.
Yes,
You mentioned a lost verse. Is it your opinion that this lost verse would have added to or detracted from the impact?
my opinion, so the question was whether the lost verse, which you can find it, there are recordings online of Bill Danoff recording it. The lost verse is about naked hippies in a field and a dog eating rice. So I think the song was meant to be, in some ways, like a tribute to some of their friends who lived in West Virginia and who lived on a commune in Paw Paw. So to me, I guess it depends on who the listener is, whether I think it adds or detracts. I think it's really funny, and I think it's really great, but the song never would have been an international hit with that lost verse. Yes, in the back.
When you say WVU bought the royalties, bought the song, right? Tell me they received the royalties?
WVU? No, not my understanding, but they can use it in almost unlimited capacities.
They don't own the song.
No, they do not own the song, though they got usage rights. In the very back, in the.
Since we have Bob here at the end, are we gonna sing this song?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we are, Margaret, yes. That's why I'm still here.
We have maybe time for one more question, and then we can sing, but I'm gonna step away from the mic. Yes.
A long time ago, I heard that they changed the word, that it was originally got canned with someone that stayed.
So the origin story is that Bill Danoff and Taffy Nyberg, who were a couple at the time, they were driving to a family reunion in Maryland along Clopper Road. And the original refrain was just country roads, country roads, country roads. So he's playing the guitar and they're driving along. And what he said was it reminded him of his home in Massachusetts. But Massachusetts was never written into the song, right? That West Virginia had been expansion, that it was something that they were inspired to write about by folks they already knew here. Are we gonna sing?
Thank you, Dr. Morris. Thank you. What a great way to spend lunchtime with music. Yes, Eli was here last week. I hate following Eli. He's so great. Yes, we're going to sing it right now. Are you ready? You got to help me out. I need background singers. Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountain, Shenandoah River. You can stand up, that's good. I was up there, older than the tree, younger than the mountain, blowing like a breeze, saying, country road, take me home to the place I belong, West Virginia, not too long, take me home, country road. All my memories gather around her. My nurse lady, straight to blue water. Running great, dark and dusty, painted on the sky. Distant taste of moonshine, teardrops in my eyes. Country road, take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, not too long ago, take me home, country road. I hear a voice in the morning hours, she calls me, with your mind to your home, far away. Driving down the road, I get a feeling that I should have been home yesterday. Down country road, take me home to the place I belong. Not too long, take me home. Country road, everybody out. Country road, take me home. I want to hear it. Come on. To the place I belong. Not too long, take me home. Country road, take me home. Down the country road, take me home. Down the country road. Thanks, everybody.